If at any point during my talk I stutter or stammer or pause, it's not because I'm nervous or forgot my talk, it's because I have a stutter. So thank you in advance for your patience and understanding if and when this happens. Currently, I live in a house with 5 other guys, and frankly, we're disgusting. Sorry, Mom. Dirty dishes are scattered throughout the house. There's a strange scent wafting through the hallways, and who knows what is living under the couch. Most of the mess is generated in our kitchen, as we find ourselves in the constant battle of overbuying food and underutilizing the food that we buy. None of us are intentionally wasteful, but when you share a fridge with 5 other people, rotten vegetables, forgotten fruit, and 10-day-old takeout become common household items. Food waste is in fact a universal problem. Every year, around 1/3 of all food in the world is wasted. And in the US, 133 billion pounds of food are wasted each year. And this makes up about 30 to 40% of the entire US food supply. To help you visualize, this is approximately 1.7 million average-sized humpback whales of food. That's a lot, and that's just the US. The majority of this food waste ends up in a landfill, where it begins to emit methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas that further contributes to climate change. So how do we combat this complex problem? One solution is composting. Let's go, woo! Composting, I'm gonna explain this to you like I would to my grandmother. Nini, composting is the process where organic waste, such as dead leaves and food scraps, are recycled and made into a valuable fertilizer that can enrich soil and plants. Anything that grows eventually decomposes. Composting simply speeds up that process by providing an ideal environment for bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that help with decomposition. Basically, composting turns your average food scraps into what farmers call black gold. And if you still don't believe me about the positive impact that compost can make, today in the US, 28% of all items that end up in a landfill can be composted. And if everybody were to compost their food waste in the US, that would be the emissions equivalent of removing 7.8 million cars off of the road. Yeah, it's a lot, I know. So now that you know what composting is and its potential impact, I'm sure you're wondering how to do it. Well, that's why I'm here. There are many ways that you can compost. One way is called backyard composting. And this can look like creating a pile or using a tumbler, and you can get really creative when designing your own system and method and mixture of what your compost is going to be. And although this method has become very popular, it is not as accessible for people like me who live in more urban environments where there is simply less space and more pests. So another solution is industrial composting. Someone such as Collective Resource here in Evanston picks up your organic waste and they bring it to another location where they have massive piles that are aerated and eventually made into compost. This method can handle a large amount of a variety of compostable materials, but it requires ongoing payment, which is not as accessible for everybody. And as this method has become more popular, still in the US, only 27% of the entire population has access to some kind of composting program. In Illinois, there is no statewide composting program, but there are many of other awesome, great organizations, such as Collective Resource, that are helping to make this more accessible. So now, let's go back to this smelly bunch of college kids that need some help with their food waste. My roommates and I currently use the industrial composting method, thanks to the amazing student organization here at school called Katsu Compost that I'm proudly a part of. Let's go, repping the team. Every day we put our food scraps and organic waste into a bucket, And then every week, if we're lucky, we lug it over to a drop-off site where Collective Resource takes it from there. And this method was working, but I was so curious what other solutions existed. Having a passion for composting, I love to talk trash, literally. And through conversations with friends and community members here at school, I was introduced to another method and to a friend named Mariano who showed me these guys. Big reveal, uh-oh. Put this down. What I have here are red wiggler worms. AKA the composting worms. Maybe in the front you guys can see this. I know they're a little small, but I know this is a bit underwhelming, and you're probably just as confused as I was when I first saw them, but trust me, these worms are a protagonist in the food waste saga. I'll just put it back. Worm composting, or vermiculture, is the process where worms live in a suitable environment where they eat food and create a usable fertilizer. Scientifically, this process is amazing. They do not have eyes, but instead, they have tiny sensory cells in their mouths that alert them when they have found nutritious scraps. The process is pretty straightforward. Food enters their mouth, travels through their body, they absorb some nutrients in their intestine, and they excrete a nutrient-rich material called castings. Now, these castings are the good stuff. I know this looks like your average soil, but trust me, it's not. These castings are what make worm composting so effective and powerful. They are alive with soil-friendly bacteria and helpful nutrients such as calcium, magnesium, and copper. Gardeners and farmers love to use these castings to mix in with their regular soil because it helps make their soil more porous and nutrient-rich. So you might be thinking, so Arthur, can I do this with those earthworms I find on the ground when it rains outside? The short answer is no. Those common earthworms are called nightcrawlers. And unlike the red wiggler worms, they cannot eat as much food and they need to burrow deep down in the soil, unlike red wigglers. I did not know any of this when I first met Mariano that fateful spring day. And I certainly didn't know much of this when I ended up adopting his worms at the beginning of this year. Yeah. All I had was a box of worms, some food scraps, and 5 roommates who were too lazy to buy a dustpan. Seriously, we still don't own one. And after a lot of experience and trial and error and blood, sweat, and tears, I have developed my own simple steps of how to worm compost. Smart. Set up your bin, make the bedding, adopt some worms, release the food scraps, and take out the castings. So first, I'm gonna call in my lovely stage mate to my right. He's a little shy, so just give him a little warming up. What I have here is my beautiful plastic bin that I was kindly given to as a gift. And these are just your average storage, plastic storage bins from Walmart or a similar store like that. We'll start off here with the lid. It's like a menu. There's holes in the lid to allow for air to go in and out of the bin so the worms can breathe. And as I don't know if you guys can see in the back, but this bin setup has 2 different bins. Yeah, pretty crazy, I know. The first bin, and we can get it out, has, the first bin has the worms and the food scraps, actually has holes on the bottom. I don't know if you guys can see, but trust me, it has holes on the bottom so that liquid can drain so the habitat doesn't get too wet. And the bin on the very bottom has a sawed bottom. Maybe you can see this a little better. So the habitat stays closed so no worms leave or pests get in. Now it's time to make that bed. And I don't mean your average pillow and blankets situation, which is a good thing since my roommates and I are pretty bad at that too. We are. What I mean is the bedding, which is a dry, dampened material that acts to simulate the worm's natural habitat and is part of their diet. It looks pretty good, right? Bedding also helps make more air in the bin, just helps with the overall flow. And recently I made my own bedding out of shredded paper and some cardboard. I sprayed some water on it to get it moist enough for the worms, and voila, the worms were set. Now, it's time for what it's all about. Get in those worms, baby, let's go, woo! I was fortunate to adopt some worms from my friend Mariano and my other good friend Tim. But there are many of other awesome online sources where you can get your own worms too. It really depends how many worms you want based off how much you want to compost. If you're just starting off, maybe get a ½ pound of worms, which should be around 500 red wigglers and cost anywhere from $20 to $40. And if you get a few worms, you're like, oh, I need more red wigglers in my life. Don't worry, because they can double their population every 2 to 3 months. Yeah, they're getting busy in that bin. They're having a good time, let me tell you. So you have your worms, and when I got my worms, I was so excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, here we go. I'm gonna feed them some apple slices and a bunch of kale. But the next day, I opened my bin to mayhem. They were leaving, running for the hills. A dozen or so worms were crawling on the sides of my bin, attempting to escape. It turns out they were trying to leave because they didn't like their environment. I had overfed my worms and put too much moisture in the castings. And after a few weeks, I finally got the hang of it and found the right balance. And to test it out, I would grab a handful of the castings and squeeze it. If it felt like a wet sponge, that was perfect. Any wetter or any drier was not good. I've also figured out what to feed them. These days, I feed them simple fruits and vegetables, and their favorites include bananas, apples, and eggshells. I don't feed them anything with citrus, onion, garlic, oils, or anything spicy or too acidic. In addition to figuring out what I should feed them, it was also really important for me to figure out how I should feed them. So first I cut up the food scraps into tiny pieces. I know it looks like a green glob, but it looks a little better than that. You gotta just bear with me. Then I dig a little hole in the beddings and the castings, and finally I put the food scraps in the hole and recover them with the castings and bedding. And by doing this, this makes this process mostly odorless. You heard me right, odorless. The bin will have mostly an earthy smell because the food scraps are covered and the worms are able to eat the food before it grows any anaerobic bacteria, which is the stuff that actually causes the stank. And this whole process really depends on many variables, such as how many worms you have, what you're feeding them, and how often you feed them. Personally, I feed my worms once a week or until they finish their snack. And over months of getting the right balance and figuring this out, it was a bit hard to tell how many castings they had made. It was clear that it was more than I first started with, and I also know that worms can eat up to 25% of their body weight each day. And you know, what comes in must go out, so progress had clearly been made, and it was time to get those castings. Let's go, we're excited. I ended up doing the dump and sort method in my living room, thank you roommates, where I laid out 2 big tarps and I put handfuls of the worms and castings on them. And after a while, I waited for the worms to retreat down to the bottom of the piles, and I scooped off the pure black gold on top and put that in another bin. And after the whole process was over, I had this new batch of castings that I can now mix with regular potting soil to create a garden this spring, which I am so happy about and stoked about. Let's go, woohoo. Woo, yeah, gardening. Thank you, I'm excited. I don't have any food today, but maybe that's next time. After I removed the worms from the castings, I put them back in the bin, put a thin layer of those old castings, made some new bedding, and now we're starting this whole process all over again. Now, when you leave this auditorium, I won't expect all of you to go out and find your own worm soulmates, but I do hope you remember these 3 things. Food waste is a massive problem that's happening right now. Composting is a great solution. Whether you want to do backyard composting, subscribe to a local composting service, or start your own worm farm. There are many awesome options. And finally, if you become a worm farmer, be smart. Set up your bin, make the bedding, adopt some worms, release the food scraps, and take out those castings. Throughout this journey with these wiggly homies and my new family, it hasn't always been easy. It's been a lot of learning and growing and being engaged and being really humbled. And these worms may not have inspired my roommates and I to clean our house, but hopefully they inspire you and others to find small, intentional ways to reduce your food waste. In this current era of climate change and feeling lost and hopeless, these worms can empower us. We can make change, one worm at a time. Thank you.